right. Welcome, everyone, to the We Can Reason webinar series. Everyone is welcome, and all of our webinars are free, but we do have a few expenses, such as Meetup and Zoom and the webpage and other things. So please donate. Any amount you can. Just go to the Rocky Mountain Atheist webpage and click on the donate button. And we are an inclusive community of atheists, humanists, skeptics, and secular freethinkers. And we welcome people of all backgrounds and identities. And we have never had any disruptive attendees at our webinars. And with your help, we hope to maintain that record. Discussion is encouraged as long as everyone shows respect for each other. Now, at the end of this session, we will have a Q&A. And if you have a question, please use the hand-raising icon, which you'll find by clicking the reactions button below. We'll call on you to unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question. But after you've asked your question, please lower your hand because it can get very confusing. And now it is my great privilege to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Phil Zuckerman. Phil is a professor of sociology and secular studies at Pitzer College in Claremont, California. And he's written several books, including What It Means to Be Moral, Living the Secular Life, and Society Without God, and several more. And if I tried to list all of his accomplishments, there wouldn't be time for him to speak tonight. So I will turn it over to him, and he will talk to us about why are atheists so moral. And so over to you, Phil. The floor is yours.
It's okay if you want to list all my accomplishments. I don't mind. I'll wait. Thank you so much for that nice, kind introduction. And thanks for having me. And I've never been to Calgary, but I would like to. I've also always wanted to go to Nelson, and that's on my to-do list. And my wife's father was Canadian, so she qualifies for citizenship. So I submitted the paperwork about 15 months ago, and we're waiting to get it all squared away.
Super.
So maybe I'll meet some of you in person one day when we come on up and visit. So let me just a little bit more about myself so you know where I'm coming from. I think a lot of people always are curious about that. I grew up in Southern California. I was born in 1969. So I grew up in the 70s. My parents are Jewish. My mom's parents were refugees from the Czech Republic. My dad's parents were immigrants from from Poland. My dad's parents were atheists, hardcore. They were socialists, not communists. They hated the communists, but they were socialists. And part of that was, seeing religion as part of the problem, not the solution. And they immigrated illegally into US. Actually, my grandfather was deported to Montreal, and he snuck out of the holding cell and in the snow and got back in again illegally to New York. My mom's parents were not, would never, I don't think, describe themselves as atheists. I think they just weren't interested in religion. They were sort of agnostic, indifferent, more interested in literature, movies, music, things like that. Hiking, they were big hikers, and the beach. So my dad grew up in New York. My mom grew up in LA, and that's where they met in LA, and that's where I grew up in the 70s. Very culturally Jewish in terms of celebrating certain holidays. My father's first language was Yiddish. My mother's first language was German. So, got a lot of the cultural aspects and community aspects of Jewish life, which includes some religious elements, although, I'm a third generation non-believer. All four of my grandparents were non-believers. My parents are non-believers, and here I am. And I grew up in a pretty secular corner of the world. The coastal part of LA where I grew up in the 70s, almost nobody went to church. I didn't know any evangelicals. I didn't know even any believing Catholics. I certainly didn't know any Muslims or Hindus. And there were just a lot of kind of secular Jews and secular Christians. I really didn't kind of come face to face with any evangelicals till high school, and it just kind of fascinated me. I thought religion was something that had died out during the Salem witch trials. I didn't realize it was still alive and well. And the more I learned about religion's presence in the United States, the more intrigued I was, and also a little freaked out. I'm a little bit freaked out by religious belief. It kind of unnerves me, some of it, not all of it. I think there's pretty reasonable or non-crazy versions that I can accept, certain sort of philosophical spins that come from certain religious stories that I'm okay with. But the literal stuff, I just thought, how can any human being believe this stuff? So that's kind of, I went to Oregon for my undergrad. I studied sociology, which I'm happy to talk about. I did my master's and PhD there, and studying what's called the sociology of religion, where you sort of study religion, not the theology, not the history, but kind of the lived social experience of religion, religion as it manifests itself in society in the here and now, as an institution, as a player in politics, as a player in nationalism, as a player in our sex lives, our family lives, kind of how religion functions in relation to other aspects of the social world. And I loved that. I got my first job in Southern California at a small liberal arts college. It's Pitzer College. It's one of the Claremont colleges. And then about 10 or 15 years ago, I became part of a movement to start something called secular studies, which is the study of secular people, secular culture, secular movements, past and present. And I'm happy to talk about that as well. So a biggie, so that's quickly a 5-minute sketch there. A biggie for me in my research is, and it really is a US issue, probably less so in Canada, but a little bit as well. Definitely non-issue in places like Scandinavia, but in the US, this connection between religiosity and morality is really strong. Sometimes I feel like God's job has shifted. Like in the past, people needed God to explain rainbows and the aurora borealis and earthquakes and tidal waves and natural phenomena. And then with each natural phenomena that we were able to explain naturally, God's kind of job description kept getting hacked. And you never hear anybody anymore say like, well, where do rainbows come if there's no God? No one says that anymore, because we understand how rainbows occur. So really what's God left, his job description, all that seems to be left is kind of like, well, why is there something instead of nothing? It had to be, where did everything come from? That's the one that they've still pull out. And the other one is, well, how can you be moral if there's no God? If there's no magical invisible deity, then morality can't, it's just every man or woman for themselves, no wrong, no absolute wrong, no absolute right. And life will just disintegrate into a chaos of self-interested, ghoulish barbarity. And that just didn't correspond with my understanding of research and reality. So the first thing I did was study societies where religion is very weak, particularly God belief, not just church attendance, because that's just kind of a behavior. You can attend church and not necessarily believe. A lot of people do that. You might go because your spouse goes, or you might go because you like the music or whatever. But God belief specifically, so I lived for a couple of years in Denmark, where God belief and church attendance, prayer, belief in the Bible are extremely low, not the lowest, but they're extremely low. And I started looking at correlations between societies that are democracies, right? Democracies, not ugly atheist dictatorships, and we can talk about that. But among democracies, I kept showing that actually the most godless democracies on earth today are doing quite well in terms of peace, prosperity, well-being, health, et cetera, low murder rates, what you name it. That doesn't prove it's because of their low religiosity, but it does prove that a lack of religiosity doesn't lead to societal chaos and destruction. And then I did the same thing for the states here in the US. I did the same thing for counties. I kept seeing these strong correlations showing that actually the least religious states and counties in the United States are doing the best in terms of standard sociological measures of societal health. And the most God-fearing, God-believing, God-worshiping counties and states in the United States are actually suffering the most from highest murder rates, poverty rates, you name it. Haven't done it for the provinces in Canada. I probably should do that. But even when I did all that analysis, people kept saying, yeah, Phil, but at root, how do individuals have their morality? And again, it just didn't par with my sense of reality. So I started doing research on individual morality and its correlations with God belief and atheism. And that's pretty much going to be what I present now for the next 10 or 15 minutes or so. So that's where I'm headed now. First of all, when you call somebody moral, or when you say that act is moral or that person is moral, it's an adjective. It's like saying something's beautiful or something is or someone is intelligent or someone is savvy or prudent or courageous. It's like, well, what do you mean exactly? And adjectives only have meaning in their context. In fact, I could make up a word, and if I started using it consistently to describe a certain person, describe their behavior as blah, 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 you'd eventually know what blah, blah, blah meant by the context of what I'm saying and the story I was telling about the person. If I said, Jane is so Quagmire. I mean, every time Jane tells a story, people are just captivated. I mean, Jane's Quagmireness is incredible. Last time she was telling a story yesterday, people were laughing, people were engaged. She just has that certain Quagmire. If I just kept saying that, eventually you'd know that Quagmire meant, like, I don't know, charismatic storyteller or funny or humorous or good way with people. So moral's an adjective, and adjectives, again, only have meaning in their context. So what do I mean by, what does anybody, there's no scientific definition, if you wanted to say like zinc, that's a specific noun that refers to a specific thing. Zinc is not subjective, it's not context-based, it's just zinc. I'm not a chemist, but I don't know what zinc is made of, but I think it's an element, so it's just itself. But it's a particular thing, it's a noun. But moral is not a noun, it's an adjective. And so when we're talking about morality, we have to say, well, what do we mean by moral? And this goes back to the ancient philosophers. There's a Socratic dialogue written down by Plato where Euthyphro and his counterpart debate what morality is. But for all intents and purposes, anytime you engage this, you have to stop and say, well, wait, what do you mean by moral? And then you can proceed. So my definition of moral may not be yours or may not be somebody else's. Someone's definition may be, obeying God is moral. Oh, well, if that's what you mean by moral, yeah, atheists are not going to do very well. It's not what I mean by moral. When I describe a person or a situation or an action as moral, it has the following qualities. It seeks to alleviate unwanted suffering. It seeks to improve fairness and justice. It's about treating others the way we want to be treated. It's compassionate. It's empathetic. It's treating others with honesty, in good faith. But really what's key for me is that alleviating of unwanted suffering. I see that as moral or ethical action. If you're debating, should I do this? Should I do not that? Should I lie to this person? Should I steal from this person? Should I help this person in a car wreck? Should I cheat on my taxes? At the end of the day, it's about, am I acting in such a way that I'm harming others or am I helping others? Am I acting in such a way so that I'm increasing fairness and justice in the world or decreasing it? So an action or an intention that alleviates unwanted suffering, helps those that want help, makes the world a more just and fair place, I'm going to call that moral. Boom. And again, we can debate that. So just for all you philosophers out there, no, I don't see morality as objective. I see it as intrinsically subjective. It's just what we mean by it in certain contexts, and people can disagree on its meaning. So now I'm getting closer to the title of the talk. If I look at the world today, on this particular day, I'm pretty depressed. We have more gun lovers in this with each child that's shot in America. We get 10 more people that want an AR-15 and love it. With each school shooting, the state legislators make gun access even easier. They get rid of gun restrictions. There is a contingent in this country that just seems to want everybody to become a mass murderer and want all our children to live in fear. It's a really depressing time. And it's one of the main reasons I asked my wife to initiate her Canadian citizenship so we could get out of here when the fascists eventually take over. Although there's some good news on that front, actually. Trump's not doing so well. So I came up with my 10 leading moral issues of the day. These are issues that Americans, USAians, I don't know if it's I don't think guns is a debated issue in Canada. I could be wrong. I know that you have some Trump type folks up there, but I think they're a minority. But anyway, from a USA perspective, these were the 10 issues that I felt are the biggest moral questions or issues of our day. The first one is guns and access to assault weapons that are tools of mass murder. What you can find in the research is that there's a strong correlation between the more godly you are, meaning the more you believe in God without any doubts, and the more you go to church, and the more you pray, the more in the United States, the more likely you are to love guns and want everybody to have easy access to them, even children. And the more godless you are, and the least time you go to church, and the less time you pray, and the less you believe in Jesus, the more you want sane gun legislation that stops citizens from having easy access to semi-automatic weapons. And you want background checks, and you want mental health checks, and you want licensing. So that's an interesting correlation, because if religiosity met morality and there's suffering involved in gun deaths, you would think that you might be the opposite. Next issue, the climate crisis. Talk about impending suffering and doom for our nation. We find the exact same correlation. You can look up the studies. The more God-believing USAers, I don't want to say Americans, because I don't know what the best word is, because it doesn't include Canadians, but the more Americans, how about that, that there are, the more godful they are, and the more church-going they are, and the more Jesus-loving they are, and the more Bible-believing they are, the more likely they are to dismiss the science around climate change, the more likely they are to oppose policies that might halt global warming. And the more godless are much more understanding of the environmental crisis and more supportive of policies to address it. Next, immigrants and refugees, whether they're from Venezuela, Syria, Ukraine, you name it. Even though Christianity tells this story about no room at the inn and how sad it was that Mary and Joseph couldn't find a place to stay while pregnant with baby Jesus, I don't know what people clearly aren't getting the message from that story, because here in the United States, atheists and agnostics are the most supportive of welcoming and helping refugees and immigrants. And the strong Christians among us and the strong God believers are the least supportive. Race issues. One of America's major original sins, along with genocide of the Native Americans. When it comes to multiple questions on racial justice, whether it's supporting civil rights, whether it's supporting movements like Black Lives Matter, whether it's supporting reparations, whether it's supporting more health care and elder care and child care for poor Black communities, whether it's for having fair hiring practices, you name it. The atheists and agnostics and non-religious are report the lowest levels of racism or racist, even just measures of racism. You can look at the psychological research, meta-analyses. Agnostics come in as white agnostics register the least levels or degrees of racism when they try to measure these things and tease them out. I got a few more. Women's rights, whether that's women's rights to live the lives they want in whatever careers they want or families they want, or whether it's women's ability to control their own reproductive organs or their own health care. The atheists, agnostics, and humanists and secular folks are the most supportive of women's empowerment and autonomy and bodily autonomy, and the more religious. So it's not just, I want to be clear, it's not just you're either this or you're that. It is a continuum. So yeah, the mildly, liberally, moderate religious, they're not as extreme. They tilt towards the secular, but they're not as secular as the fully atheist and agnostic. So you could see it as a spectrum here. So a corollary of women's rights is just simply abortion, which is under assault here in the United States and is, illegal in many states. And maybe we may have just even the abortion pill, the morning after pill, may be illegal in all 50 states because of a ruling by a Trump-appointed judge in Texas. And again, atheists, agnostics, and secular folk are the most likely to support women's free choice on that matter. LGBTQ rights, whether it's gay marriage, gay adoption, transgender affirmation, whatever you name it, the atheists and agnostics and humanists are on the side of empathy and compassion, and the strong God believers are on the side of condemnation and unacceptance and intolerance. Healthcare, like talk about an issue that should be about suffering and care for other human beings. You saw this with the COVID debate too, but I'll forget that for now. I'm so tired of COVID. But with the healthcare, whether it's universal subsidized healthcare for everyone, whether it's healthcare for the poor, whatever it is, you name it, whether it's tax dollars to support our hospitals, prenatal care, you name it, the more secular or more supportive, the more religious or not. Got two more for you. Death penalty. Even though their savior was a victim of the death penalty, atheists and agnostics tend to be the most opposed to it, and fundamentalist evangelical white Christians tend to be the most supportive. And finally, what I would just call Trumpism, which is the movement in the United States to end our democracy and replace it with a totalitarian fascist regime. The correlation is so explicitly strong that atheists and agnostics are the most pro-democracy and the least supportive of this fascist takeover, while evangelicals and strong Christians and strong believers, even among Jews, Orthodox Jews, are the most supportive of Trumpism. So I've gone through 10. I haven't, I didn't even mention animal rights, but you see the same correlations. So whatever it is, and you can ask me, and if you want, I didn't want to just have percentage after percentage after number after number after number. I thought that would get boring, but if you need the studies, just let me know, or I can even send you articles. So when I look at this, and I forget my in-depth interviews with people who are non-believers and are still moral, or even they're only, you counted 9. Let's see, guns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I conflated women's rights was one and abortion was another one. Sorry about that. But thanks for watching that. 10 is so Old Testament too. Maybe I should have stopped at 9 anyway. So then the question I'm going to ask, and this is where I'll sort of wind things up and we can open it up for conversation and discussion. And I can know more what you really want to focus in on and hone in on and talk about. So the question is, to sum all this up, on the leading questions of the day that I think are moral issues, right? To me, a debate over guns is not about, economics. It's about suffering and life and the sanctity of life. Debates about everything I've listed to me, healthcare issues, these are moral questions. And I think that's why they're so important. Atheists and agnostics and secular people in general take the more empathetic, compassionate position that will decrease the most suffering. So the question then becomes, why? What's going on here? So the notion that, how can you be moral if you don't believe in God? That's a projection. It's actually kind of the opposite. At least in a USA context, the question is, how can you be moral if you believe in God? If, the strong God believers are taking these immoral positions. And of course, the moderate God believers are somewhere in the middle, but the moderate God believers already have a secularized version of God. It's a sort of vague, metaphorical, non-literal version, which is great. I'd rather have someone have that version than not, but it already in itself is somewhat secularized. So what's going on here? The truth is, I don't think anybody has solved this, but I have some speculations, some based on research, some based on ongoing thoughts and suspicions. First of all, we know that in the studies that we have on morality, the more godless people are, tend to base their morality on empathy and compassion. That seems to be the guiding motivation when people are taking social psychological studies that try to get at this, or even when they're just asked, or all of the above. It has to be about, well, I want to treat people that way because I know what it would be like to suffer that. So there's a kind of empathetic thing going on, putting oneself in another person's shoes, or compassion, just care for the suffering of others. What doesn't seem to motivate atheists and agnostics is obedience to rules or obedience to laws. So a typical godless person won't care if something's legal or illegal in terms of their moral compass. They'll ask, who suffers from this? How? Is that suffering deserved? Is it alleviatable, et cetera, et cetera. The more God believers are much more obedience-based. When they are asked to explain their own morality, they talk much more about obedience to authority, either temporal or divine, following of rules, following leaders, And again, this is either from their own articulation or in studies that try to tease this out through choices people make or correlations they make, and the various mechanisms that social psychologists try to tease out what's going on underneath the surface. So something's at play there. Now, that is a little bit of a tautology. I mean, to say, well, atheists and agnostics are more moral because they have more compassion and empathy. It's like, well, right. What's causing this? I don't know. Another factor that is obvious about atheists is we live in the here and now to a much greater degree. We aren't expecting an afterlife. We don't believe in an afterlife. So we have a much more of an immediate sense of our actions, what needs to be done, the finitude of our being here, the finiteness of life, the precariousness of life. We don't see life as just some kind of dress rehearsal for a much bigger Broadway show that's going to last for all eternity. And I do think that affects our moral compasses. Next, and this is a bit of a stretch, but I have a lot of studies show, social psychological studies, that godless people and secular people in general are better at coping with ambiguity. It doesn't make us as uncomfortable. The more God believers don't like ambiguous situations, it increases their anxiety. They like to have clear-cut understandings of what's happening and clear-cut answers to questions. I think we are more comfortable with ambiguity, and I think that relates to our morality, because I think we do a little bit of a better job of coping with tough moral questions. For example, abortion, right? Even if we can't quite say, well, when does life actually begin? What's the difference between ending a 9-month pregnancy, a 6-month pregnancy, a 3-month pregnancy, a 2-month, where are we out there? And we recognize that there are competing factors at play: the health and wellness of the mother, the wantedness of the baby, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's certain issues where we're much more able to navigate the reasoning to a better degree, but I could be wrong on that front. Finally, social psychology does show that godless and secular people tend to have an internal locus of control, where religious and God believers tend to have an external locus of control. And what that means is, when you're trying to understand people's personalities, in general, there's ways you can understand, like, do people kind of see their life at the whim of outside external forces that kind of are controlling and shaping them, whether it's fate, whether it's God, whether it's aliens, whether it's other people or other institutions. They tend to sort of see that the locus, the power in their lives, is outside of them, and they're sort of leaves blowing in the wind. Religious people tend to take that approach more and have that orientation. Secular people have a much more internal locus of control. They tend to see their life as they're more the drivers of their own life, for better or worse. They feel like they have a bit more control over themselves and their destiny and their lives, understanding that you can't control everything, but that your choices have consequences and your choices are the driving switchboard of your existence. And I think that also, on a certain level, relates to morality, because if you have an internal locus of control, I think you're more aware of your effect on others, causes and consequences of your behavior, as opposed to just, well, it couldn't be helped, or this is just the way it is, which I think, again, leads to a more, I'm just going to follow rules from the invisible being in the sky, and that's what it will mean to be moral. But the last point here is, I really don't know. I'm still trying to work this out. Why is it that godless people are exhibiting such strong correlations towards the moral and ethical end of the among the 10 most pressing moral issues of the day? It's particularly noteworthy when the largest religion in this country is Christianity, which claims to be a religion of peace, forgiveness, love. The prophet of Christianity, the Messiah of Christianity, said, don't fight back evil, turn the other cheek, give to the poor, the homeless, the hungry. It's almost as if you were to take a list of every teaching Jesus put forth on the Sermon on the Mount or in his other parables. His followers today are doing the opposite. And us godless folks who see Jesus as more of a myth than anything else, we seem to be wanting to live more by those kind of peaceful, ending the suffering of others principles. And it's just a great irony that I have yet, it's a mystery that I've yet to fully solve or crack, but clearly something's going on here when you see such correlations on every issue. It'd be one thing if it was like, well, on this issue, but not that, on this moral question, but not that. And it was kind of all over the place. And then I'll just go back to my earlier point. When you look at the countries today, there are 7 democracies right now that have more non-believers in God than believers in God. This is a first in recorded human history. Again, forgetting the communist dictatorships, which are hellholes, and I'm happy to talk about. Among democracies, the 7 democracies today, where now a majority of people, say they do not believe in God. Estonia, Czech Republic, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, South Korea, and the United Kingdom. Probably British Columbia if it was a country, but I haven't checked the numbers. Those 7 countries exhibit some of the highest degrees of human welfare, equality, women's rights, gay rights, attention to climate crisis, abolishment of the death penalty, no AR-15s in every teenager's closet. They're not perfect societies. There's terrible drug problems in Scotland, and South Korea has, can't replace itself. They're not having kids anymore. Like, there's problem, immigration issues in Sweden, you name it. I'm not saying these are perfect paradises. They're certainly not utopias, but they're as far from dystopias as you can get, with the possible exception of my favorite island, which is Salt Spring Island. I have spent some time there in the Channel Islands. So these are some of the observations that I see as a social scientist, that even though they relate, that relate to morality, that relate to how we treat others. And so I believe that there is great value in atheism and agnosticism, not just because it's living in reality, but it seems to strongly correlate with heightened empathy and heightened compassion at the individual level, but also at the national level. And with that, I'm welcoming your comments and questions. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Phil. All right. Well, we've already got some hands up. Peter, go ahead.
Hi, Phil. Thank you. It's really great to hear. And yeah, Nelson's beautiful, by the way. I was born in Castlegar, so I know the area. The question I have is that I'm really curious to know is, looking at, like, there's a strong contingent of European countries. I know you did mention like Korea there, but European countries that seem to have moved beyond religion being so powerful, and it was at one time. Do you think the rest of the world just needs time to catch up? Like, do you think, is there, like, what it's happening in, say, America now, did that happen there too? Was there's this push back to basics, kind of try and desperately hang on to religion, and then eventually they got past it?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you, Peter. I should also add that Japan's almost there, still a majority believe, but almost not quite there. Thailand actually has a majority of non-believers, but I can't call them a democracy anymore because of the recent political shenanigans. So there are a few others up there, but you're right. Europe definitely is kind of the epicenter. I shouldn't say that. Japan is quite irreligious. South Korea, Vietnam, but it's hard because Vietnam's a dictatorship. So, for all intents and purposes, you're right that Europe, which was the citadel of Christendom and is now the kind of post-Christian society. And of course, in Latin America, the most secular society is Uruguay, which is the most European of the Latin American nations. So you're right, there's something going on there. Will the rest of the world catch up? This is what I will say. I think there are many causes of secularization, probably 4 or 5 that are just, when society experiences X, religion tends to go down. And if I had to put number one up there, it would be when societies do a really good job of creating stable, safe environments for their citizens, meaning people's existence is generally secure. Everybody, it's relatively peaceful. There's not a lot of political turmoil. There's not a lot of war. Everybody has healthcare, a roof over their head, education, elder care, childcare. When those basic principles of what we call the welfare state, when those are widely instituted, but it also has to come with freedom. It can't be the kind of Chinese or Soviet model where, yes, everybody will get a teapot for, 1 zloty or whatever, but there's no freedom of the press, no freedom of speech. So it has to be, when you have a democracy where people, it's government by the consent of the governed, and then people's lives are relatively, you can't there's always going to be car accidents and there's always going to be strokes, and, you can't solve everything. But when most people, most of the time, feel that their lives are relatively secure, then you see the need, the psychological need, the sociological need for religion to go down. So what I would say is Europe's done an incredible job post-World War II of instituting, an aggressive welfare state, particularly in the Nordic countries, but throughout, Netherlands as well. And what I would say is Canada kind of is in the, if I look at Scandinavia and the United States, Canada's kind of in the middle in terms of the welfare state. And what's interesting to me is Canada's also kind of in the middle when it comes to religiosity and secularity. It's, again, these are all just correlations, but it's pretty interesting. So what I would say is if other nations around the world are able to institute welfare democracies, yes, then I would predict that religion would go the way of Scotland and the Netherlands. However, if the world continues to experience climate crises and dictatorships and warfare and ethnic strife and inequality, then I don't think religion's going anywhere. I mean, it's no surprise that the most religious continent on planet Earth by every account is Africa, which suffers the most from poverty. So again, the correlations between well-being in society and a lack of religiosity, and then suffering and instability. You don't know where your next meal is going to come from. You don't know when the next war is going to start. You don't know who the next dictator is going to be. You don't know where your pills or medicine is going to come from, or if your kids are even going to go to school or not. That's when religion is going to spike.
Thank you. Gavin.
Thank you. Thank you, Phil. I guess a question I have, and I think you kind of answered a little bit around it, but I wanted to put a point on it. Do you find that this is bared out because atheists are more proactively good? I mean, and by that I mean they have thought these things out and have come to a logical conclusion on these things? Or is it more of a reactive, passive thing that, like many of us here in Rocky Mountain Atheists have come from a religious background? Is it more that people who are atheist have seen that imposition on other people's lives and they just don't want it? It's more of a reactive thing. So is it a positive, proactive, or reactive? Just I know it's bad, just go away.
Yeah, there's a lot there to unpack and untangle, so I may not touch on everything you've kind of brought to that. So I'm just gonna do my best. So you are right that many people who are atheists or agnostics today grew up in religion and left it. Most of us, right, grew up with some kind of religion and then left it. So there is a kind of reaction to that. There was probably some kind of reflection, intellectual debate, internal sense, reasoning through your choices, why you didn't believe this and what do you believe. So I agree with you that is at play. However, we see the same correlations even with people that weren't raised with much religion. I'm currently interviewing Estonians right now because it's one of the most godless societies. And I'm actually interviewing people who were raised by non-believing parents. So it's a triple effect. I'm interviewing non-believers who had non-believing parents and grew up in a majority non-believing society. And they also sort of exhibit these moral proclivities. So I don't know. I think sometimes, yes, it's reactive. Sometimes it's just an innate disposition. In terms of proactively good, I actually will say there is a lot of research in the United States that actually suggests religious people are more donate more and volunteer more than their secular peers in the USA. And that, I think, is a communal effect. I don't think it's about belief. It's about being part of a community that provides these opportunities consistently. And the reason we know that is because affiliated seculars, so atheists and agnostics who are part of groups like you are in the United States, tend to have the exact same levels of volunteering and charitable. So it's more about opportunity and networks and community than actual faith or belief. But I do think there is something to, and I also will say most of I've interviewed hundreds of Danes and Swedes in my day. I'm currently interviewing Estonians right now, and I'm going to move on to Czechs and others, and Americans. I've interviewed a lot of Americans in my research about these kinds of questions. And what I will say is what I find most, now, not so much for affiliated people like you, and you are rare, just so you know, secular people that choose to be part of a secular group are the far and away minority of secular people. Most non-religious people just move on from religion and don't care to, they wouldn't want to join a secular group. They don't see the point. So you're unusual, as am I. But when you talk to your average godless person, your average non-believer, meaning one that's not affiliated but just doesn't believe, and you sit them down for an interview, they actually, not always, but they actually have a difficult time articulating their values and morals. It's not they don't have a bullet point 10 commandment list, right? They don't say, well, I get my morals from the Bible. If you ask them, where do you get your morals from? They have to sort of ponder that for a while. If you ask them, what are the values you try to live your life by? They've often never even been really thought of it that way. And they have to sort of stop, and there's a deep reflection that goes in. Whereas I find that strong religious people have a very knee-jerk, they can answer that right away. Where do I get my morals? The Bible. Where do I get my morals? The 10 Commandments. Where does morality come from? It comes from God. What does it mean to be moral? Follow Jesus. They have these kind of pat answers that are so, but even though it takes the godless people longer to think about, they think about it. And I think that's kind of getting to your point, that there is that reflection, and certainly people like you who are reading books about what it means to be a non-believer, who are having conversations, I would think have a heightened sense of morality, because you're contending with it to a degree that I think most people don't, other than philosophy majors.
Thank you very much. That was a very good answer.
Okay. All right. I passed. Whew, that was a tough one.
James. You're muted, James, or Jim, rather.
Jim, yeah.
Okay, a few comments. When you mentioned Czechoslovakia and refugee, I immediately thought of the '68 invasion. Was that, or was that before?
Czechoslovakia was invaded in '68. You bet.
Yeah, and your parents left then, or
no? My mom's folks. So my mom's folks, there was no Czechoslovakia when they were born. It was called Austria-Hungary, and they were from a region called Bohemia, part of the Sudetenland. So they were German-speaking Jews of Austria-Hungary, and they had to escape because of the Holocaust. So they got out they moved to Berlin and were living under false names, but obviously that wasn't going to work. So they got out in 38, and then with my aunt, and then my mom was born in Brentwood. And then my dad's folks were from Poland, and my dad's folks got out earlier in the late 20s. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Let's see. I guess the first time I saw a discussion about the whole religiosity and morality thing, it was by a guy named Gregory Paul.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know Greg.
Yeah. So, he just sort of gave the scatter plots of measures of religiosity versus measures of crime rates and things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So did his paper get you in, or were you already into the whole notion looking at this problem before that?
I was already doing my research for Society Without God, which was the book I published, and where I was trying to make the same argument. But Greg beat me to it by publishing the first refereed journal article. Right. And I was just like, oh my gosh, well, so it goes, people have these ideas, they're out there. But we immediately became, corresponded. We met at a conference, and I had him contribute a chapter to a book I edited. So I would say he beat me. We actually co-wrote a piece in the Washington Post as well on our shared interest. So I didn't get it from him. I was already smelling that. I was already on the hunt and was writing my book, Society Without God. And I think it came out, but he beat me to it in that academic publishing article. So
who's Darwin and who's Wallace? And this also made me thought of Haidt's, Haidt's moral, the basis for morality that people use.
Yeah.
I don't know. Has everybody got some idea of what that's about?
Can you explain it better, Jim? What are you referring to?
Okay. Let's see. There was so there were a bunch. So some are fairly common and to pretty much everybody, and but some are just kind of, the more liberal people tend to regard them as unimportant. Like, okay, harm care and is one that sort of the liberals, secular people go for. Let's see, there's let's see, there was freedom, which of course is the very libertarians, but then the liberals tend to approve of that to some extent. Now, the second one that's very much a liberal secular thing, I'm trying to pull it out of the back of my head, but there was but the ones that the conservatives tend to go for are the respect for authority, loyalty to a group, and purity. And I would regard all of those as secondary, that I would respect an authority to the extent that doing so helps those other those other three. Ditto loyalty to the group. Does loyalty to the group help people be well off?
Can you put it in the form of a question, Jim?
What's that?
Can you put this in the form of a question, please?
Oh, okay. Okay. I guess it just does Phil see that as sort of a connected thing to this whole because the religious people tend to use these different bases for their morality, the authority, etc.
I read one of Jonathan Haidt's book. I believe, it's the Something Mind. I loved it. I thought it was a great read. I highly recommend it. And yes, he talks about these 6, I believe, aspects or versions of morality, and he tries to bring in views from India and all over the world. And it's all fine if that's how you want to define morality. That's great. But I definitely, it's just still arbitrary. This is what we're going to mean by morality, and then that's fine. But to me, it's all interesting, but I haven't mapped his 6 onto these kind of secular religious divides. One could, though. It'd be an interesting exercise.
Yeah, like the respect for authority certainly sounds like more of a religious.
Right. And I wouldn't even consider that moral. So to me, this is what I mean by it's arbitrary. It's like, if that's how you want to define morality, great. You could also define morality as enjoying pineapple. Like you could define morality however you want. If obedience to authority that's not when I say someone's moral, I don't mean they're really good at following orders. It's actually quite the opposite. I would say a moral person doesn't just follow orders, but they care about the consequences of their actions, and in fact are willing to say no to an order from on high if they think that order will result in suffering. So this is what I mean by, you have to first say, what do you mean by moral? And then you can have the broader discussion.
Thank you. Okay, Stephen, what's your question?
Good evening, everyone, and good evening to you, Professor Zuckerman.
Hi, Stephen.
Hello. Hi. I'm also teaching at university, so you and I are both in the same trade. Before I start, I'd like to let you know a bit about my background, because I come from a different angle. I grew up in the Orient. Actually, my ancestral family is from Taiwan, and I grew up in Hong Kong, which was a very metropolitan city, and so I met people from all over the world, and I went to a Catholic school in Hong Kong. Now, back then, before Hong Kong got returned to China under British rule, it was actually the freedom of speech and the rule of law was actually quite prominent. And then, of course, the last 25 years after 1997, when Hong Kong returned to mainland China and all the freedom freedom of speech, newspaper that don't agree with the government all got shut down now. So it's basically China running Hong Kong, basically. All the middle class intellectual are finding ways to leave. And actually, they don't have enough students in grade school right now.
Mm.
And sadly, of course, my ancestral home, Taiwan, is under the threat of being invaded by China.
Mm-hmm.
So, when I grew up, Hong Kong, there was religion freedom was very widespread. We have Catholic, we have Protestant, Buddhist, Taoism, and Muslim, and all sorts of religion is coexist. Nobody is going to fight because you are Catholic and I'm Protestant and we're going to be at each other's neck. No, that doesn't happen. Everybody accept. If we are Hindu, that's fine. We have an Indian, South Indian population there, Hindu and Sikh. So religion, all prosper, all flourish there. There's no fighting. Now, that is not true in many parts of the world. And coming to Canada and look at other parts of the world, and especially the Middle East, I just start to wonder why actually when I was there was no issue of what you believe. You could believe anything you want. You go to your church, nobody will say, I don't believe in this, you are wrong. No, it's not an issue at all. Why is it different religion is such an issue in different countries? And I think of way back then, Northern Ireland, Catholic versus Protestant, they are at each other's throat.
Yeah.
Well, they believe in the same God. They all believe in Jesus Christ. What's the matter? What is wrong there?
Well, thanks for sharing, and thanks for sharing your background and your experience in Hong Kong, and mention of Taiwan and the religious diversity that seemed to be so harmonious in Hong Kong. And if your question is why in some areas is religion such a toxic source of conflict, it's not my area of expertise, and I would just have to speculate. And I would say there's multiple issues at play. I think a broader perspective would say, well, I don't even want to go there. I think there's too many factors at play, and it's not the only conflict. There are many nationalistic conflicts are ugly. Not all conflicts have a religious component. If we politics, if we look at Pol Pot and what happened in Cambodia, if we look at what Mao did to his people, if we look at what Stalin did, if we look at what's happening, I mean, I think there's many nationalism, politics, religion, and you mix them all together, it's a particularly awful brew. When people are fighting over resources, when they're in tough circumstances, and these nationalism, these are divisions. These are divisions, dividing that tribalism. It taps into tribalism. Sometimes the tribalism will be your God or my interpretation of God. Sometimes the tribalism is about language. Sometimes it's about skin color. Sometimes it's about, all these things. And I think the story of humanity is trying to overcome these divisions and see us all as one. And I would argue that even though religion preaches brotherhood and sisterhood, it tends to more often than not increase tribalism, increase nationalism, and but not always. And we have to acknowledge that sometimes people have horrific battles and genocides, and it has nothing to do with religion. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But ultimately, I don't know. I think it's part of our bioevolutionary past. It's part of our economics. It's part. There's a lot going on there. Like right now in the United States, I mean, the right now.
You mentioned about using religion, nationalism, and tribalism. I remember a book I read many years ago, and it was a book written by Madeleine Albright, the former U.S. Secretary of State under Bill Clinton. And the book is called The Mighty and the Almighty. It's a very interesting book. It's her experience as the Secretary of State of the U.S. And she's wrote in one particular chapter, she mentioned it's a negotiation between the Palestinian and the Israeli state about the forming a future state for Palestine. And she said when they are sitting down in negotiation, and when they get to the very dead end about who owns this land, the Jewish, the Israeli represented at the dead end, they will say, this land is ours because God gave it to us. And the Palestinian will quote from the Quran and said, no, 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 Allah gave this land to us. And at that point, Madeleine Albright said, you know, this is a dead end. There's no use to negotiate anymore because there's nothing to negotiate.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you, Stephen. That's interesting.
Thank
Dee Dee,
you.
do you have a question?
I do. Thank you. This has been really interesting. I just wondered if you could speak to how you're conducting your research right now. Like, how are you finding Estonians to talk to? And just a little bit about how you're going about this. Are you writing a new book? That sort of thing.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. Well, I guess it is one of the silver linings of COVID is this Zoom. It's what's allowing us to talk right now. You're up north, I'm down here, and we're able to share. And so I lived for over 2 years in Denmark conducting interviews with Danes, because it's like, well, that's what you do as a qualitative ethnographer. You go somewhere, you live somewhere, and you do in-depth interviews face to face. And I still prefer that. It's the only way to really try to understand a society. But if you want to just interview individuals, I'm using Zoom as a tool. So what I did was I have a new book that'll come out in a month. It's about secularization. It's called Beyond Doubt. And we tallied rates of God belief in, 100 countries or more. And when I saw that there were these 7 democracies now where a majority of people say no when asked if you believe in God, I was intrigued, and I made a little list of these. I call them the secular 7. And I thought, I want to interview people from these societies because, again, I want these to be, in a sense, you could argue these are the most secular people we've ever had because they themselves are non-believers. They were raised by non-believers, and they're from a non-believing majority country. So even if someone's a non-believer in the United States, they can always say, well, but your parents raised you with religious values, or the society did. But so what I do is I use what's called snowball sampling, which is a fancy way for saying, I find any contacts I can in these countries. I reach out. I say, hey, I'm looking for people that in this particular instance are engaged in charitable work or altruistic endeavors of any kind. And if they are, and then I reach out to them via email and said, hey, I got your name from so-and-so. I understand you volunteer at an animal shelter. I'm doing this research on morality and values. Are you a non-believer yourself, and were your parents non-believers? And if they say yes, I say, okay, you qualify for my study. Would you like to do a Zoom interview next week at 10 o'clock? And then when I'm done with that interview, I say to them, hey, you mentioned so-and-so. Do you have any friends or neighbors or colleagues that are doing any kind of volunteer work? And if they say, oh yeah, my aunt, she's a volunteer medic in the National Guard or whatever, so it kind of grows from there. So it's not a random sample, which means I can't statistically generalize. It's what we call a convenience sample. I'm just kind of interviewing who I can. I also will send emails to charitable organizations in Estonia and say, hey, I'm looking for people to interview. Can you send them my way? So it's just a convenient sample, but the kind of work I'm doing right now is just having one-on-one in-depth conversations. So I'm just trying to understand people's worldviews. And so it's less about statistical. I can't make a statistical argument. I can't say X% of Estonians or X%, but by hearing people's stories, it helps me get a better sense of how they think through these things and how they look at the world. So I hope it'll be a book, but it's really in the early stages. I'm still in my first country, so I plan to do about 20 from each country. So I got a long way to go. But with Zoom, it's really nice. I can do 3 or 4 Zoom interviews a week, which is pretty amazing. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you. So Andy, would you like to ask a question? Would you unmute yourself there?
Yeah, I was trying to get there. Hi, Phil. Thank you very much for this. I appreciate it.
You bet.
Raised by atheists. So I actually had some observations that I wanted to make and see how that fit within the scope of what you were talking about, because I think you touched upon some of it. So what I see is that, Jesus is kind of like the base of all Christianity in this country. But it seems to me that the more fundamentalist you are, the more you tend to side and quote Paul, whereas the more liberal you are in terms of Christianity, the more you tend to quote Jesus. Jesus healed the sick, he fed the hungry, he hung out with thieves and prostitutes, and he just kind of like was a man of the world. Whereas Paul was much more about, this is the way you do this is how you do this. All his letters were telling the churches what they were doing wrong and how they should be doing it and who should they listen to. The Old Testament is very much about, here is what you're supposed to do. Here's your role in life. This is what a man is supposed to be. This is what a woman is supposed to be. You need to be strong. You need to be harsh. You need to be this. Your God is this awesome, powerful God. And your leader has to be this awesome, powerful people, and the man head of the family has to be this awesome, powerful people, and you given these strong roles in these harsh kinds of worldviews. And so the more fundamentalists I see them tending to be more on that spectrum, whereas the more liberal and especially the more secular are completely away from that. And so I see this spectrum coming from that, and that, again, sexuality is something that once the pill came out, there was no reason to claim sex as this evil thing. But in these states where they're trying to ban the pill or trying to make it harsher, make abortion harder, make, all of these things harder, it's like sex is kind of like, a prelude to marriage. You have sex and then you get married. And that there's no in between, there's no dating. It's fact, it's just, someone gets pregnant and then there's this forced marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And so this kind of, it seems to me the far right, it just seems to me is that they're trying to rebring in these kinds of situations where you're forced into this kind of a world, and that you're forced to take these roles, you're forced to do these things. Mm-hmm. And it is a harshness. It is an eye for an eye, as opposed to turn the other cheek. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, I heard you kind of mention this when you were talking about the more liberal Christians, and I see this as a big major difference between the fundamentalist and the less fundamentalist and the more secular.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with you. I think there's a rigidity of roles, men's roles, women's roles, family roles, government's role. I think, again, and this relates a little bit to the comfort with ambiguity, the external or internal locus of control. When parents in the United States are asked in these surveys, like, what traits or characteristics would you like to see in your children? The number one that religious people say is obedience to authority. And the number, 48 is thinking for oneself. And it's completely the opposite. Atheists and agnostic and secular parents, when they're asked this question, what characteristics or traits do you want to see in your children? Their number one is thinking for oneself, thinking for themselves. And the last one is obedience to authority. So you're right. I agree with how you're painting these things. And I think the more religious of any religion, not just Christian, but the more religious Muslims, the more religious Mormons, the more religious, they like roles to be clearly defined, the life cycle to be clearly defined, gender norms to be clearly defined, sexual mores to be clearly defined. And there's this fear of normlessness. There's this fear of freedom. Eric Fromm wrote a book called Escape from Freedom back in the 50s, where he said, we all talk about freedom. Freedom is so great. It's so great. Freedom is terrifying. Freedom is horrific. And he says there's a strong tendency in people to not want freedom. They want to be told, they want daddy to tell them how to behave. And those of us that are more religious tend to be more comfortable in that rigid lifestyle. And those of us who are more secular, we obviously can't stand that. We want to be the masters of our own fate. We want freedom. We want choice. We want autonomy. But those things they both come with a price. The price of autonomy and freedom is existential. It's what the heart of existentialism. What Sartre and Camus said was that actually angst is a very real reaction to freedom. It's like, holy shit, if nothing matters and if I determine my own fate, that's terrifying. There's a feeling of groundlessness. The world just the rug is pulled out from under you. You mean I'm the one that has to make these decisions? I want mommy or daddy to tell me what to do. That's more comfortable. And those of us, I think, that continue to want that, we stay religious. And those of us that prefer to grow up and be autonomous adults, mentally and emotionally and morally, we tend to be more secular. But I love what you said about Old Testament and Paul and Jesus, that whole thing, all good.
Yep. Thank you for your comments, and thank you for your speech.
Thank you. So, Gavin, do you have another question?
I do have another question. In your studies of religiosity versus secularism, atheism, do you have varying degrees of this, or is it
Absolutely.
Is there
No,
Okay.
and that's the greatest thing. So I mean, there's multiple different studies with multiple different indicators and variables, but I'll give you an example. When I correlate states or counties, I use Pew's data, and they will ask about your belief in God, not just do you or don't you, but they will say, which of the following, best describes you? I completely and fully believe in God without any doubts whatsoever, might be one option. I believe in God with a few doubts. I believe in God with some substantial doubts. I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure if there's a God, but I lean towards there is. I'm not sure if there's a God, but I lean towards there's not. I don't believe in God, but sometimes wonder if I'm wrong. And, I definitely do not believe in God no matter what. So you have this range. So you can even correlate. That's just on the God question, right? But you can ask people all kinds of this in all kinds of ways. You can even ask people, they can have the option of, do you believe in God? Or do you believe in a higher power? So they don't want to use the God word, but they like higher power. I believe in a universal force or spirit. So, it just depends on the study. It depends on the research. So definitely we try to get away from these binaries, either or, religious or secular. And of course, with in-depth interviews, that's where you can really unpack it. The problem with in-depth interviews is they're not quantifiable. So I can't give it, but with an in-depth interview, I can sit down with a person and say, what do you even mean by believe? What do you even mean by God? What do you even mean by, this and that? So that's why I personally enjoy in-depth interviews more. They're much more valid and rich, but they can't be statistically generalized. Whereas the broader survey data and national data, then you have to have these very clear, discrete variables. But so yes, a good study will not just make it, either or, but will try to measure degree. Certainly that's easy to do with church attendance, because you can say, never, every now and then, once a year, twice a year, once a month, weekly, daily, same thing with prayer, frequency of church attendance. And then when it comes to God belief, you can even ask people, how religious do you feel? Very extremely religious, somewhat religious, kind of religious, neither religious nor, somewhat non-religious, very non-religious, completely non-religious, so those are the ideal, And so what I was trying to say with those 10 issues, those political, moral issues, I was talking specifically about, even when you have this kind of scaling, it's the more extreme religious are the more immoral on these, and the more extreme. So it's not just that kind of like, non-religious people. It's like actually atheists, self-described atheists tend to be the most extreme when it comes to wanting to stop gun violence, wanting to address this climate crisis. So even when it's not just either or, but even when you gauge it by this kind of spectrum, you see these correlations. Not always every time, particularly the death penalty. For example, you have a lot of African Americans who oppose the death penalty, and they're highly religious. So some of these things get a little bit wonky, but by and large, 89% of the time, that extreme is there.
Wow.
Okay, thank you. I was looking to see if there's something, not just belief, but how you profess it, like Muslims and Jews. There's some sects in
Oh,
there.
yeah.
You have to you dress that certain way. I
Huge
was raised
difference.
Catholic, and mom dragged us to church every week, but she talked about the C&E Catholics. They were just Catholic enough to show up for Christmas and Easter Mass.
Oh, that
versus,
sounds good.
like, all like those kind of divisions that seem like, in one way, it's how religious versus atheist are you, but it also kind of is a map of where would you be your next step to go one direction or the other.
Yeah, exactly. So in my current book, we use belief, behavior, and belonging as the three variables. Belief in God or supernatural beings, your behavior. So that would be church attendance, frequency of prayer, things that you actually do. And then belonging is just affiliation. Like some people just identify with a religion or as religious, even if they don't believe or do the, so you have these three levels and they all have, a 10-point scale. So
Thank you. Very, very interesting.
you bet.
Thank you. Bart, would you unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi, great talk tonight. Thanks, Phil, and everyone else. Really interesting research. I want to push back a little bit on what you're saying about atheists being more open to ambiguity. It makes sense, and I mostly can see it and agree with the relationships I've had with hard believers, but I don't know. I feel like each group, in group, attracts information and cherry picks information that kind of feeds that narrative,
Right.
and so I want to ask, what are your thoughts on the idea that Trump gained more racial minority votes between 2016 and 2020, according to Washington Post exit polls, polling 25,000 people, and I'll put the link in the description here. But after 4 years, of the seemingly misogynistic, racist, homophobic, I think in this poll that I'm going to post, it didn't show sexual orientation, but I think he gained more homosexual votes as well. It's just really interesting that is lost in the narrative. But what are your thoughts on the ability for atheists to grapple with ambiguity like that?
Okay, so good stuff. Thank you so much, Bart. Couple things I'll say in response, and then we'll get to the Trump poll and stuff like that. So first of all, what I was referring to was not necessarily ambiguity about their positions, because you're right, atheists tend to be pretty convinced and confirm that there is no God, whereas agnostics tend to be a little bit more like, who can say, who knows? But it was more this psychological studies that just try to present ambiguous situations to people and then measure their levels of anxiety. So it's a bit of a fuzzy indicator. I just wanted to be clear on that one. And so to piggyback on that, I absolutely agree with you that atheists, especially strong affiliate atheists, can be very stubborn and subject to biases and filtering out things that don't fit the narrative and they don't want to accept. For example, what I see more often than not is atheists will only pick the worst examples of religion and ignore the best examples. So if you look at Facebook, if you look at Twitter, the hardcore atheists will always reduce religion to its worst manifestation and say, well, that's religion, but they hate it when people do that to atheists. So when a Christian says, well, look, Stalin was an atheist, atheists will get all ups in flames, like, well, Stalin, blah, blah, blah. And what about this great atheist and that great atheist? And we're not all like this. But then you look at the atheist feeds online and it's all like, they always use Pat Robertson or some awful religious person as the poster boy for religion. So I agree with you that those in-group biases can feed just as fiercely among atheists as they can among Christian fundamentalists. Now, I think what you're saying is, an example would be, what do we do with the fact that Trump saw an uptick of, I'm certainly aware of certain communities of color. I don't know about sexual orientation. I look forward to seeing that. And so I think what you're saying is that that your average atheist anti-Trumper wants to just sort of ignore that data and be like, hey, he's a racist. And so my response to that would be you're correct that Trump did see an uptick. However, what I would argue is he did so terribly among groups, particularly African Americans. He didn't do so terribly among Latinx people. In fact, in the first election, he won 33% of the Hispanic vote, which is remarkable. He only got about, if I can't remember, and I may be wrong, but like 8% of the African American vote. And so you're right, those did tick up a little bit. But even among African Americans, if he got like 8% in 2000, whatever, and then it went up to 12%. To me, that's still, yes, you're right. It is more people of color voting for him despite his racism. But I think the larger point you're trying to make is that it seems like a lot of left-wing atheists just kind of tune that stuff out, those counter narratives out. And I think you're right. I think we are all subject to that confirmation bias, and we just weed out things that challenge our worldview or challenge our notion of how things are, and we just double down on the things that affirm it. So but I would say, I don't have the data, but I think secular people aren't as bad, but maybe that's just my own bias. So I don't know any studies on confirmation bias, but I would love to find. I wouldn't be surprised if they found that the more religious you are, the more subject you are to confirmation bias, and the less. But it could be wrong. It might just be this is a fundamental human trait that afflicts us all. So thank you, Bart, for bringing those issues up. And I hate to say it, but I gotta end at 7:30. I hope that's okay.
Okay, well, let's try to get these 3 questions in really quick if we can. Brent, ask your question, please.
So I think we have evidence that morality is evolving over time. People are becoming less religious. From a biological point of view, do you see religion ever disappearing, or is it built into our code that a lot of us are always going to be have an appeal to an authoritarian environment?
Ooh, that's a good question. So this is what I would say. It depends what you mean by religion. I think there are certain predispositions that stem from our bioevolutionary past of hundreds of thousands and millions of years of living as pack animals in small groups as mammals that predispose us to certain aspects of religion. Certainly the in-group favoritism and out-group suspicion, certainly the ability or the instinct to assume agency in things, even if there isn't. I think that was evolutionarily adaptive. If you assumed that noise you heard was a stalking cheetah, even if it might have just been snow falling outside the cave, you did a better job of surviving than the people who were like, it's just snow out there, So that instinct to sort of assume things have agency, even if they don't, that instinct to I think we are susceptible to stories and myths in a way that is instinctive. So I think there's a lot of aspects, Pascal Boyer talks a lot about this, and others, Stuart Guthrie. I think there's a lot to our evolutionary past that predisposes us to certain aspects of religion. However, the evidence that makes me question that is number one, the quickness with which in certain populations can shed their religiosity. I mean, if you look at Scotland in 100 years, or even less, that's even 70 years, that's 1 or 2 generations went from being a majority believing to a majority non-believing. We see the same thing in many societies around the world. So if it's that predisposed and it's that bioevolutionary and that genetic, how could something like that just evaporate so quickly? Second of all, when you look at the data on how children are raised, so I tend to think, even though we are predisposed to assume there's a man's face in the moon, even if there isn't, even though we're predisposed towards tribalism, we're predisposed towards ritual, we're predisposed to all these myth making and all these, and even believing there's a supernatural daddy watching us and all those things. If you look at children who are raised by non-religious parents, they overwhelmingly become non-religious adults. Overwhelmingly, 85%, depending on the study. So what that says to me is we are socializable, if our parents teach us to believe, we most likely will. But if we're not taught to be religious, most of us, most of the time, don't end up. Not all of us, not all the time. There's always that variation at play. So this is a long way of me saying I'm of two minds. Sometimes I feel like we are always predisposed to be religious, and folks like you and me, or I don't know, I'm assuming we're the exception. We're just unusual. Just like, most people are heterosexual and some of us are homosexual. Most people can see color, but some of us are colorblind. Most of us don't have perfect pitch, but some of us do. It seems like most humans are destined to be religious, and a few of us are just not made that way. But again, when I see whole free societies that are giving up religion, I think maybe it's not so hardwired after all. And if people aren't socialized into it, it may go away.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Thank you. We'll try at least one more. Jill, what is your question? Would you unmute yourself?
Working on it. Okay, thank you. Phil, I've been really enjoying this discussion. On your wish list of whatever you could see happening, how would you promote or encourage a society like the United States or Canada, who's waffling in the middle, to become non-secular? How would you see that happening? What would you think that we could do? Like, what could be seen to be encouraged? Or is this just so your pipe dream? What would you like to see? I guess.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my ideal society is close to Scandinavia in terms of, everybody having their basic needs met, with still some inequalities. So the rich people in Denmark are quite rich, and the poor people in Denmark are living in not the best quarters, but they all have the same access to the same healthcare and the same schools and the same parental leave and, all those basics. So to me, that would be ideal. I also do like a kind of secularized version of religion. In other words, I think religion does provide a lot. It provides community, ritual. It sacralizes certain parts of life, death, marriage, birth. So I'm not against all. I don't want to see a religionless world where there's no. I think these stories and the teachings and the history and the heritage has some function for lots of people. I just wish it got rid of the supernatural nonsense. So I'm a big fan of non-supernatural religious traditions. And you see that in Judaism. You see it. There are a lot of Unitarians that have pulled that off. There's a lot of Silent Friend Quakers that have pulled that off. So, and in Scandinavia, the Lutherans, the pastors don't even believe in God, but they like the traditions and the teachings. So how do we do that? I think there's three things. On the one hand, you work for just a better society in general. You work for more fairness, better social welfare, better democracy, better human rights, and that by default will decrease the supernatural aspects of religion. But we can't all change. So that is number one. I think Obamacare, for example, will do more to secularize America than the latest, my latest speech or Richard Dawkins' next bestseller or whatever. On the other hand, I also still think we have to make secular movement part of the conversation. So just as there are movements to promote religion or movements to promote environmentalism or gay rights or Black civil rights or whatever it is, I think secularists need to be engaged in those conversations. As secularists, we believe in these secular values. We are humanists. We believe in separation of church and state. We believe in free thought and rationalism and reason. So I think on the one hand, we work for a better society for everybody, which will corrode the need for religious superstition, but we also have to be engaged activists ourselves. And then third, we partner with those groups, be they religious or not, that share our values. So if we have a value of women's bodily autonomy, we partner as secularists, as humanists, with pro-choice movements or even religious groups that support women's rights to choose. We make it known, we are secular, we are humanists, and these are our values. In Norway, there's something called the Human Ethics Forbund, the Human Ethical Society. And it's so in Norway, which is Lutheran, all the kids when they're 14 are supposed to get confirmated in the Lutheran church. And it's a big ritual, kind of like a bar mitzvah or whatever. You get you take some classes and you have this big public confirmation. And it's such a big rite of passage, and there's usually a party and presents, but so many of the kids didn't want to say what they didn't believe. And so the Human Ethics Forbund, one of their biggest services has been to provide ethical secular versions of confirmation where you do a project and there's still a ceremony and you do some good in the world and you go through some training and then you are confirmed as an ethical person, and it's hugely successful. So I would like to see that kind of stuff happening here as well. So I don't have all the answers, and it's a long slog, and it's easy to get discouraged when we see the state of the world. Whether it's, in the impending invasion of Taiwan, which was mentioned earlier, or Trumpism here and the guns. And I'm not sure what's going on these days in Canada, but I know you had a bunch of truckers against COVID, or for COVID, or whatever you want to call it. But, yeah, so that's the best I can see. Why work for a better world universally, locally get involved in secular activism, and then partner with groups that share your values would be my best bet.
Well, thank you very much for answering that.
Oh, thank you. I'm so sorry, but I have to tend to my family now.
Well, thank you ever so much. We can't thank you enough, Phil, for coming and spending this time with us. Appreciate
Thanks for
it so
reaching
much.
out.
And
Thank
have
you
a good
so
evening.
much. You too. Thanks. So nice to talk with you and see you all. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, we can stay on and continue to talk and discuss the talk. That was fantastic. So, Peter, do you want to start?
Yeah,
the discussion?
I'll throw it out. That Phil's not here but took a little bit of exception to something he said, but I think just for me, it's something that would need to be clarified, and I think most everybody here would understand. But working with people who are formerly religious, people who have been raised from birth in religion, the comment that those who prefer freedom or autonomy tend to leave religion, I think it just has to be qualified that it's not always people's choice to leave religion. It's a reality that comes to them, and that facing autonomy can be a really terrifying and huge adjustment for people who leave religion. And so I know he was talking in generalities of maybe what a study said, but I just kind of felt like I wanted to comment on that, because it could, to be honest, like a friend that I spent hours telling how I came to my point of leaving religion, a very long, opening up and telling, and made the off-cuff comment that, well, people stop going to church all the time. Like, people leave religion all the time. It's no big deal. And I just thought, like, this is someone who has not been part of religion that has controlled his life, and it's it just couldn't relate. So, anyways, I wanted to throw that out for, I don't know what everybody else thinks, but and I'm disappointed that Finland wasn't mentioned.
You'll have to write to him and tell him to study Finland.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, it's interesting because he didn't mention Finland in that group of 7, and yet Finland is just like for 2 years in a row has come up with, quote, the happiest country in the world, and it's based on one of the things that he highlighted is like a very equilateral society where people feel their needs are met in that. However, knowing Finns and knowing Finnish society, if this is based on surveys, they just wouldn't be comfortable answering those questions. It just would be like none of your business. So it's interesting, even a fact like that may really skew a study like that. So
interesting.
So you're saying we don't have the data on their religiosity?
Well, I'm saying it would be skewed by the fact that if it's a survey, the way the survey style is done, that Finns are very, very private about their private life, and they would not be interested in participating nor diverging that information.
Okay.
Yeah.
Stephen, do you have a comment? You are still muted, Stephen.
You're a mutant.
Hello. Hi. Okay. I forgot whether did he mention about Denmark. I thought Denmark was at the top of the list. It's one of the Scandinavian country being what the happiest country in the world. One of the things that was discussed about was about evolution. That was brought up, and through evolution and whether we are being ethical and moral, it's because it's something that was built in through our evolution. A few weeks ago, there was actually this document on 60 Minutes about the wolf and the dog. I don't know whether anybody watched that. It's very interesting how evolution, wolf evolved into the dog, and why that happened. And according to the scientists, it seems like maybe 10 or 15,000 years ago, a group of wolves, a pack of wolves, because there's a mutation in one of their genes, they became less aggressive and they built their den closer to human settlements. And they got closer to humans, and then they started scavengers of the humans left over. And because they became less aggressive, they kind of made friends with humans, and then they evolved into the dogs. And that was the nature of evolution. Because of that, the wolf that became the dog, and they survived, they flourish. And then looking at the human race, 100,000 years ago, basically we have 5 different types of humanoids. And one group, which is us, with the gene mutation, we become more friendly, cooperative, ethical, and becomes friendlier to each other as the group, because that is the best way to survive. So we help each other out. So in fact, nowadays, when the baby was born in the genetic baby, they are very innocent. And if you don't teach them to be aggressive, to be selfish, if it's just a normal brought up, the kids will share things with others. But then because of the scarcity of, let's say, resources, land, or whatever, we started to have conflict, and we started to become aggressive. So it wasn't the gene when you were born was not being bad, immoral, aggressive, and fight each other. No, that was brought up because of the environment, the scarcity of resources.
Fascinating.
So religion being saying that it's moral to teach us moral because of religion, that doesn't really drive. And one of the things I remember about religion, especially in the Eastern religion like Buddhism, reincarnation, and that is basically like a threat. There is a fault, there is this thing, if you go off the rail, and if you don't behave in this life, you are bad, you go to the next life and you'll be a dog. Okay, that's the Buddhist concept, reincarnation. And so that is a threat there. So if you don't behave, you are going to suffer in your next life. So you better keep on the track.
Yeah, that's one way. Thank you, Stephen. That's interesting. Andy, do you have a comment?
Yeah, just kind of on the evolutionary side of things. If you watch Naked and Afraid, somebody always gets hurt. They get cut, they get sick, something happens, and so the other person has to take care of them. It seems as if, you know, the person who's not sick has to now carry on the load of both people. They have to take care of the shelter, they have to do the hunting, they have to get the food, they have to do everything. So there's an incentive to take care of the person who's sick, that's hurt. There's an incentive because you don't want to have to carry that whole load by yourself. You need another hunter. You need somebody else to help you fend off the jackals from your gazelle. And so you actually want them to get better, and you want to take care of them. You want to make them better. It's selfish in a sense. You know, altruism in this way is kind of a selfish thing that works in the population. And I think, you can see it on this TV program. It's just right there in your face. I know it's kind of edited and it's not exactly, straightforward, but it is kind of a great concept about how things have been.
Yeah, I've read things like that with respect to, well, again, evolution, that we take care of each other because we need each other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I just put in the chat there that if along this line, I just listened to an excellent Thinking Atheist podcast where Seth interviews a primatologist whose specialty has been like animal morality, and there's a lot of discussion about this and things like observing that acts of reconciliation in animals. And it started with like chimps and bonobos, but it's been observed in over 40 different species of animals. And it's like, why would animals like make up after they have a fight? And why would they? And it's they have a great discussion about that whole thing, is like, how do you divide that line between what is altruistic, but is also, it's always a little bit selfish, because if it helps the group, it helps you and it helps your species, and etc. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, it's an excellent podcast.
Oh, sounds great.
Lois, I have to run. I appreciate you inviting me to this. It was wonderful, as usual. And I will hear and see you next time I hear and see you.
You will, and it won't be as long as it has been. Thanks, Andy.
You're always welcome. Bye bye, you guys.
By the way,
Bye-bye.
I like your background, Andy.
Yeah, it's my angel.
Okay, thanks a lot. Jill, do you have a comment? Go ahead, Jill.
I do. Actually, I just wanted to backtrack a little bit to something that Peter had mentioned earlier about, and I may be paraphrasing incorrectly, Peter, so please correct me, that you yourself had found it very difficult, and it was a very long journey and a difficult journey for you to leave the church, and just to have this person kind of flippantly say to you, well, people leave the church all the time. Am I correct in that?
Yeah. Basically, he seemed to not get the like how big of a decision it is for some people. And
yes. But I guess the comment I wanted to state to you, and one of the things that I learned when I had a horse and I had to learn how to train with a horse, is to learn to live outside your comfort zone. And that was where true growth happens. So by you moving outside of your comfort zone, you have grown as a person. And I just wanted to make that comment for you.
Oh, thank you, Jill.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, I think that, as much as Phil has studied, those of us who experience leaving it find it maybe slightly different. I did ask him one time. I went to another webinar where he was speaking, and from what I read in one of his books, I asked him if the more steeped you were in a fundamentalist religion, does that make you more anti-religion and a more adamant atheist? And he said in his experience, he did see that. So a lot of people that had not been steeped in religion were quite casual. Oh yeah, there's nice things in religion. Where those of us who were steeped in it were just, oh, there's nothing good about it. The good things are the things that are not religious, like the community type things, and the sense of belonging. Anyway.
Yeah. When he mentioned the racism, now depends on the sect. Like the Southern Baptist separated from the Baptist without the adjective over having slaves. So the Southern Baptists took in all the most racist whites.
Mhm.
You, yeah.
Well, I almost brought up one thing that I had been reading recently is there have been, like, what do they call it? Structural brain scans, the magnetic, I can't say it.
Functional
MRIs, structural MRIs that have shown a difference in the size of different parts of the brain, depending on how extremely conservative or extremely liberal people were, that there's literally, and well, of course, I should include the more extremely conservative tend to be more religious, and the more extremely liberal tend to be more atheist.
And
but there was literally a difference in the size of two different parts of the brain. In one end, the one side, I think the right amygdala was larger in the conservative, and I can't remember the name of the other part that was slightly larger relative to the rest of the brain in the liberal. And I thought that was fascinating. And it really makes you wonder.
And is there any evidence for which way causality goes? Like, did the parts grow by being raised?
No, in the study, they said they do not have data to indicate whether it's a cause or effect or just correlation. But it's still interesting. Yes, Peter's comment, I like.
I wanted to jump in on something Peter started a conversation there on the religion has taught, for those of us who were in a religion, it taught us here's the way the world is, the creation myths and whatever. And that's easy enough to let go, but it's the other part of it that teaches you to defer to authority. And I've always wondered if I've had that natural inclination, because if someone sounds quite certain, I tend to think that, oh, they must have good reason for believing that so firmly. And I have that thing in my brain I got to check all the time, because I defer to people who act certain, and people who act certain are that religious basis.
Yeah, that's extremely dangerous. Like, and it's not just in humans. Did you hear the stuff about the Chat GPT having hallucinations and just writing in a very confident tone about these things, which are total bullshit?
Yeah. Well, there's a good and a bad side to it, and you have to wonder where it is. Like, if someone knows what's going on, they've been there before, they can answer the question. Why figure it out for yourself? Take advantage of someone else. That's what makes us human. Yeah, but that's an awful shortcut that people can make. Like Donald Trump is an example we've been talking about. He is awfully certain about a bunch of things I am certain he doesn't know anything about. But
Gavin, that reminds me of like a favorite quote of mine from, do you know Dr. Marlene Winnell, who wrote Leaving the Fold? But it's she's the psychologist that had got the term religious trauma syndrome. Yeah, that book right there. Just it's a classic, great book. But there's something she says in there, like, because I relate on that too, Gavin, about kind of, and like she says, like, sometimes people are critical about, like, well, if these people didn't agree with religion, like, why didn't they just leave? And she said there's a high correlation of people who are in fundamentalist religion who want to please. It's their nature, and they don't want to stir things up, and they want to believe the authorities. It's very, very hard for them to let go of that, and so they often stay much, much longer than their inner self is telling them. They try and make it work so badly. And she says in her work that there's a high correlation with that. Many of the people who suffer the worst stay and suffer the longest in it as well. So,
I was, and I suspect that, and I think that ties back to Lois, what you were saying about the fundamental religious, those who have left that are very anti-religion. But I suspect that might be a bit of a survivorship bias, because only the people that could leave a fundamentalist religion are very, very independent and probably quite resentful of having that independence denied them for so long. So it's not, I would be interested to see if there's some correlation with that, like, for example, Catholics not easier to leave just not show up and be a Catholic anymore than it is to not show up at some fundamentalist thing that's part of the community that's that. So
yeah, oh, for sure. Brent, you started to say something, I think. Brent?
Oh, I was just going to comment that it's built into our social, or our nature to be that social, where we do defer to authority, I think, because, you know, the survivalship of our troop or whatever depended on those people who knew and knew what to do. So I think that's part of the appeal of deferring to authority, and it's pretty natural. I think I mean, there's always a continuum, but I think that's a pretty natural part of our psyche.
Yeah, I agree. Jill.
Yes, Jill should answer.
Hi. I also am interested in, especially in a fundamentalist religion, the people who stay the longest and have the most difficulty leaving. I'd be interested in how many of those are women and how much of that is learned behavior, because in a fundamentalist religion, you have no rights as a woman. And even in like Catholicism or the United Church, you still have that second-class citizen that I might not have had the same restrictions. It was more implied as opposed to overt. But how much of that pleasing that I wanted to do and had difficulties with, and how many other women who are in these situations going, I'm not comfortable with this, but I'm pleasing these people. How much of that is learned? That, I guess that's just my question, and I'm curious to know. That's just my curiosity, and I'm not expressing myself very well. I apologize.
No, well, I understand. I totally get what you're saying, and it is a big part of the issue. I don't how biological it is, I don't know. I don't think anybody knows, but
I think some of it is biological. Was it Brent that had mentioned about our tribalism? But also too, I mean, as a society, we're raised as women that we are to be, like, I'm very much was conditioned that I had to put everybody's needs before my own. And I had to be there and do all the things that the men weren't going to do, and pick up and do all the women's work at the church. Like, it was very socialized, but at the same time we had a very strong community, and it was really hard to leave that community.
Yeah, that makes
sense. Dr. Zuckerman actually he made that comment that the more religious, the more defined the roles. You know, he talked about that, and I think that definitely is true. And you get the more fundamental, and yes, the roles are more defined. And I think by extension, women have less say, girls have less say, et cetera, et cetera. So I agree.
Yeah. One of my favorite, this cartoon I saw years ago. Well, okay, biologically, it's known that estrogen makes you more nurturing. And that's good because mothers need to nurture their babies. But then towards middle age, you lose that estrogen. And this cartoon is a little hillbilly woman jumping up and down. She's got a rifle and a corncob pipe, and she's jumping up and down saying, I'm out of estrogen and I have a gun. And I absolutely love that cartoon. Anyway, Jim, did you have a comment?
Well, about the whole respect for authority thing. Like, to what extent, how much reason do I believe that this person claiming authority actually knows what he's talking about? You know, like, say I'm on a boat in a storm and somebody who I think has had a lot of experience taking boats through storms, I guess I'm going to follow his lead or her lead. But, you know, if I don't have reason to think that this person actually does have, and makes a choice that looks strange, I'll question that. How many people have read the Caine Mutiny, or at least know the basic story? Okay.
Know the story. Yeah.
Okay, the basic story. Basically, the captain of this ship has basically lost the respect of the crew. They don't, a lot of them just don't think he knows what he's doing. And so when they're going through a storm, some of the lesser officers just sort of do something different from what he said. So that's considered a mutiny. So that's the base. Yeah, that's Captain Queeg. Anyway, so so it turns out a bit poorly.
Yeah, you're right. So it's kind of you're saying it's kind of situational, and I would agree. Like if I get on a commercial flight, I do trust in the authority of the people that have put that pilot in that pilot seat. That person is, there is, so it's very situational. And I think in a most well-structured societies, like, I think Canadians generally, we've even had a reputation of being more trusting of authority than Americans in the past. But then there was this big protest in Ottawa, and now I question whether we have that reputation anymore. But I think up to that point, I think we actually, like, that was one of the things that distinguished us from Americans. We tend to kind of trust in our authority a little bit more and question it less,
Well,
and then I think a lot of it can be individual personality as well. So
yeah,
it's many things mixed together.
Given the benefit of the doubt, if they start, if I start seeing reasons to think, oh, this person doesn't really know what he's talking about.
But people that just sort of take control, at least at first, you just assume that they are, have leadership abilities and knowledge. And I almost did an experiment on this once when I was chairing a committee back at the college where I taught, because I've always been super shy and kind of reserved, but there were certain things that I found important about the committee. So I came on strong, and everybody just sat and took it and assumed I was right. Oh, this is interesting, So if you take authority and act like it, people will listen. It's weird.
The thing about walking through a construction site with a clipboard, and then they assume you're.
I even had it once when I was in grad school. I always wore the lab coat, and I wanted to run over to the hospital to see a fellow grad student that was in the hospital, and so I went up to the nurse's station and I asked for his room number, and they gave it to me, and they said, "Oh, that's down." They said, "Oh, I had a white coat on." They assumed that I knew everything about the hospital. It was weird. Anyway, go ahead.
I met someone in university that said that they would feed themselves well on the weekends by going to wedding receptions, and all they had to do was get a whole bunch of lights and extension cords, and they could walk in and they looked like the videographers. So,
Oh, that's interesting. That takes guts.
Well, the extreme example, of course, is that "Catch Me If You Can" story, which is,
Yeah.
based on truth. And the guy, perform surgery without training.
Yes.
Oh.
It's like, it's a good thing he was really, really smart. But you know, if I see the pilot passing me on a commercial flight and he has a yellow and black book that says, you know, flying planes for dummies, I think I'll get a little nervous.
Uh-huh. Oh. Well, that movie, if those of you that were there on Monday, the movie we saw on the cult, I mean, people followed that cult leader. It was just unbelievable.
Hi, Brenda.
Is that the Holy Hell one?
Yes.
the
Oh,
one?
yeah, that was it.
Yeah. Yeah, it's quite a documentary, that's
Oh,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
But I think I'm
so-
gonna say goodnight. Thank you, everyone. Great discussion.
good
And
to see you, Peter.
thanks,
Okay.
Lois. Isn't that- All right.
Here.
Good night.
Good night.
Right.
Oh, it is getting to be about that time, isn't it? It's 9 o'clock. I can't believe it. Oh, so
Lois. Oh,
Okay.
I was going to say thanks everybody for coming, but everybody's still not here. But thank you for coming. It was, I hope
Right.
you really, really enjoyed it. I'm in awe of Phil and the books that he's written that I've read. Just, I think it was a great opportunity, and we do have a recording. If anybody, if you want someone that you know that wasn't here to hear it, I will within the next couple of days be posting it on our YouTube channel, the Rocky Mountain Atheist YouTube channel.
Okay.
And so I think we should probably call it
Oh.
a night. Jill, it's probably getting pretty late
Okay.
there, isn't it?
Yeah, we're after 11 now.
Wow.
Okay. So
Well,
Jill,
thank-
you're somewhere.
I'm
we-
actually near Convoy country. I'm an hour from Ottawa. in,
Oh,
the,
okay.
in the heart of the Ottawa Valley, which is ultra conservative here.
Oh, wow.
Okay. Let's see. Where exactly? So.
Renfrew is between Armpire and
Oh,
Pembroke.
right.
I'm
Yes. I grew up in Ottawa. My parents had a cottage on Calumet Island. I know exactly where you are.
Yeah.
good night,
Okay,
everyone.
well, thanks
Thanks
coming,
very much,
Jill.
Lois. That was a
Okay.
wonderful.
That's
That was
great.
lovely. Thank
webinar.
you, Louis.
Yes.
Great. Well, good night, all. We'll see you
Yeah.
soon.
Right.
Bye.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay. So I guess